Thank you. I'm here representing Common Cause in Wisconsin. We have about 2,500 members across the state, and I'm here to speak vigorously opposed to this entire package. Both the process and the product are bad. The fact of the matter is we only found out about this piece of legislation, heard rumors about it on the 24th of May. It wasn't really until last week that details began to
Can you turn your mic on, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was on.
It's on the button right
Right here.
I'm sorry, thank you. We were unaware of the fact that this piece of legislation existed, let alone having been asked for input into the construction of it. The fact is that it is being rushed in a way that is very detrimental, I think, for the people of this state. And when you consider some of the ramifications of some of the provisions in this legislation, you really need to slow way down before you rush this through. We think this will do three things. This will pour more special interest money into Wisconsin elections. It'll make it far less transparent to the people of Wisconsin. And finally, despite the modest modifications to the photo voter ID law, Wisconsin will still retain the most restrictive, prohibitive photo voter ID law in the nation, more so than Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and other states that have a history of of denying people the right to vote. But I want to concentrate really on the greatest concern, which is, and I'm sorry he's not here, that James Buchan of WMC addressed, and that is that this legislation will make money in our elections much less transparent. And I don't know of another state in the nation where this has been proposed, but the provision in this bill that would actually codify into the law the fact that a communication, a campaign communication, has to be express advocacy. That is to say, it must use words like vote for, vote against, support, or defeat in order to require the disclosure of the donors. That's not happening anywhere else in the country. And in fact, Mr. Buchan, although he was right about the Buckley-Vallejo decision in 1976, conveniently skipped 3 Supreme Court decisions which said that it is perfectly acceptable that you require the disclosure of campaign communications that may not require the so-called magic words, but that have no other interpretation to the general member of the public other than trying to influence their vote. 3 Supreme Court decisions in 2003, 2007, and the Citizens United decision in 2010, which, as you all know, opened up the coffers of corporations and unions to spend unlimited money in our elections. But in that same decision, 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices challenged and in fact implored Congress and state legislatures to put specific disclosure requirements in their laws so that the people would know where all the money that was about to be dumped on them as a result of the decision would come from. 20 other states in the United States have moved in that direction and have disclosure for the types of communications that we call phony issue ads. And those are communications that are issue advocacy, but really campaign ads masquerading as issue advocacy. And it doesn't take a genius to see where this would go. Why would you decide to use a communication that said vote for or vote against when all you had to say is Representative Joe Smith is bad for the environment and wants to double your taxation? Call him and tell him not to do that. Well, clearly that's communication intended to influence the outcome of an election. But under this provision, it would now be codified in Wisconsin law that you wouldn't be able to require the disclosure of that type of communication. Chair Bernier, before she left, said she wanted positive suggestions to how to address some of these issues. And I have one. It's a Republican bill that's been introduced in this session of the legislature by Senator Michael Ellis and Representative Dean Crawford, Senate Bill 166, which would require that any communication in the period right before an election that is intended to influence the outcome would require the disclosures of the donors. People in Wisconsin ought to know who's trying to influence their vote. What this legislation will do is exactly the opposite. It will make it much easier that we could conceivably have a system in which nobody is disclosed, where nobody knows where the money's coming from, because everybody would go to the phony issue ad route in order to make campaign communications. So that in and of itself is reason, I think, for almost everybody in this legislature to oppose this legislation. Another suggestion I would have for you, by the way, is that you take the campaign finance provisions out of this omnibus bill and have a campaign finance reform bill and have an elections bill. The issues are far too great and of such great consequence that to combine them all, I think, really confuses a lot of voters and really doesn't give fair hearing and a fair discussion of what we're talking about with regard to all of this legislation. The other thing I want to say is that there is another provision in this bill that would expand the period in which lobbyists can make campaign contributions. I don't know of a single person that I've ever talked to in the state that has said we need more lobbyist contributions in our campaigns. Not a single one. And so why this provision's in here? Oh, I understand it's because the primary is now in August rather than September. But to take lobbyists, the ability of lobbyists to contribute that much closer to when the legislature is in session seems to me to be a very dangerous thing that you're asking. And people's view about, or which is already pretty much that lobbyists control everything that goes on in this building, is going to be even more detrimental, I think, to your cause if you now allow lobbyists to be able to contribute for a longer period of time. We ought to have less lobbyist contributions. We ought to have no lobbyist contributions or contributions of any kind during the consideration of the state budget. Let me just say in conclusion, a little history lesson. In 1998, we had a similar situation that we have now. There was a special election in Waukesha County to replace Lynn Edelman, who was named to the federal court. And in that election, Mary Lozick was elected state senator in an election in Wisconsin that cost about $400,000. And at that time, that was an unprecedented amount of money, and everybody was shocked. Governor Tommy Thompson, the Republican governor, called the Republican-controlled legislature into session and for a session on campaign finance reform. And the discussion then was, how can we make our elections more transparent? What can we do to diminish the amount of special interest money in our campaigns? And for 3 days in special session, the Wisconsin legislature, with the Republicans in control, battled over this issue. There was input from Democratic members. And it finally fell apart at the end because the members of the Republican leadership saw where it was going, and it was turning into a very partisan, very Republican campaign finance reform bill. And the leaders at the time, Scott Jensen and Mike Ellis, both realized that if you pass a hyper-partisan piece of legislation, that it would someday come back to bite them. And that there had been a consensus in Wisconsin for many years, and there should be now, that yes, there are partisan differences on all kinds of issues, but on issues of election, on issues of campaign finance and in transparency, it's essential that there be bipartisanship, because if there isn't, they will come apart when the next party takes control and then gets rid of all the laws that were created by the one party. It should be something you do together. So my final suggestion is, get together, let's have a bipartisan discussion about this, not a hyper-partisan bill that's being rushed through in a short period of time that you've made this available to the public. Thank you.